Hi, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. So today we're going to cover the Frac spread show, what is happening on the U.S. side, and then we're going to look at some of the quick data that came out from the U.S., and then we're going to try to link that with some of the potential impacts from the Russian sanctions, what is there, what isn't there, how things have changed. We've seen a fairly stark shift in the NATO rhetoric and stance, and then some comments from Sweden and Finland. So we want to talk about all of that because it really kind of feeds into what is happening right now. So with that being said, getting to the frac spread count and something a little bit lighter than what is happening around the world. We had an increase of 7. So we went from 283 to 290, which is a bit faster than I was expecting, to be honest with you. But one of the reasons that we're hearing on why this is the case is because there's a lot of spot work, and we're seeing some of the spot work. So some of these spreads that we're seeing could easily come in for a week or two, then come off, and then kind of piecing together some of this activity. So some of it is obviously sticky in terms of where things are, especially when we talk about price. And we're going to actually talk more about LNG and what is happening on the LNG front when we're looking at all the different impacts, because some of the increases that we saw were in the Haynesville, was in Eastern Texas, which is, again, where a lot of this LNG is, a lot of the natural gas for LNG is going to be sourced from. Now, when we look at the Permian, there was another increase. Again, that's another spot that we're seeing a decent amount of spot work. And then some of the smaller basins are also starting to see an activity increase, which is very seasonal. Typically, they start to ramp up as we go into March, and then they're active for 2 to 4 weeks, whether it's in March or April, depending on when they start up. So we should see more activity because, as we were saying, we thought 300 was very doable, but really I was assuming 300 by the time we got to mid-March, and now we're only 10 spreads away. But really, when we start looking out, the next 25 above that is going to be very difficult, just given the shortfall that we're seeing in horsepower and obviously the supply chain. Now, as you have activity ramping up, you also need to make sure that you have your rig count to make sure that those DUCs are available. So here you can see that we had an increase of 5. There was no drops, so the horizontal rigs picked up another 4. Vertical rigs picked up 1. 2 in oil, 3 in gas. So again, a lot of things, a lot of momentum. We've seen some aggressive moves on the rig side. And then obviously with what is happening on crude pricing, it's obviously very much in the money. And then just the uncertainty of supply, which we're going to talk about in a minute, because some of the things that I think are a problem is everyone keeps talking about sanctions. And now don't get me wrong, obviously sanctions are a problem, but there's also letters of credit. So in order to buy a cargo of Urals, a cargo of Russian LNG, you need a letter of credit, and banks don't want the risk. So even though there's not official sanctions, there is an issue of getting the ability to actually purchase these barrels, and so or LNG cargo. So that's some of those components that I think are missed that we want to discuss as we go forward. So when we look at some of the things that have happened in the U.S., just based on what came out today, because we had a decent data dump, as you can see, the PC deflator and the PC core deflator, which is a key metric that the Fed uses for inflation, you can see that it came in line with expectations at 0.6, and you can see that the core deflator came in at 0.5. Year over year, it's slightly higher at 6.1%, and then on the core side, 5.2%. So you can see that we're still getting this momentum, we're still getting these increases, and just given on where obviously energy prices are, the additional supply chain issues as we look at from Russia, especially when you consider a lot of these unknowns, that is going to keep the supply chain guessing, and especially from everything from aluminum and nickel all the way down to wheat and other grains. And we'll talk more about that as we go into the sanctions section. Then when we look at personal income, it was better than expected. It was expected to be at negative 0.3, came in at flat. So again, if you remember, we were assuming that wages were going to start to rally and we're going to start to catch up a little bit. And this is, I think, one of those pieces where wages are actually going to become inflationary, because you're going to see wages start to pick up as you go into as we go into February, March, April, and really May, because when you think about jobs, a lot of people wait to get their bonuses. Once they have it, they'll leave, they'll go get a new job. And again, we expect to see those wages pick up. Real spending came in just above estimates of it was expected 1.2%, came in at 1.5%, which then obviously showed some of this big increase in durable goods, cap goods. Things picked up when we look in January. But if you look at how slow things were in November, December, we get a pickup in January, and then we think we get a slowdown in Feb, and then another acceleration as we go into March and April. Now, when you look at pending home sales, they missed estimates, but again, things are a bit lumpy. And then when you look at Michigan sentiment, improved a bit from 61.7 to 62.8, while current conditions declined a bit, but expectations still kind of hugging the lows, but improving just a touch. Now, when we look at personal consumption expenditures, you can see that there is another, just putting into historical context, that we are right back to where we were in the early 80s. And again, we're seeing a lot of this acceleration, and the issues that we continue to see in the supply chain are not going to be any better. Now, before we give an update on what is happening within the Ukraine, let's look at what Russia produces. So this is just looking at production. So right now, Russia is estimated to produce at about 10.16 million barrels a day. Some of that is obviously consumed locally, and then the rest is exported via pipe as well as via by boat. So we want to look at the different pieces, because Urals have essentially remained no bid. India is actually starting to pick up some, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But this is just to put into context the amount that's actually being produced, and can OPEC actually replace these barrels. So when we look at what Russia can export by water, you can see that they were planning on about 4.176 million barrels a day. Now, mind you, this is a day. This isn't for the month. This is the amount that could be taken out of, or at least a percentage of it taken out holistically. You can see that it's back to the highs that we saw in March of 2020. This is above where they were producing and exporting in 2021. And right now, there were no offers for Urals in the Platts window. Litsgau sold CPC blend at a 22-month low. Freight rates have obviously rocketed because there's a lot of concern about the Black Sea. We've seen several ships get hit in terms of some either accidental or on purpose attacks. Again, leading things very difficult to and raising insurance rates. But regardless, as that happens, you'll see these prices come down. We're seeing that Urals have gone no bid, especially going into Europe and into the U.S. and now into China, because China also isn't issuing lines of credit. And I think that is the confusion right now, because even though sanctions aren't there, the lines of credit also have to be there, and they're not sitting there at this point. But India is. So processors from India, about 6 million barrels of Urals for crude from the Black Sea have been purchased. That's the most India has purchased in at least 3 years, and represent 6 out of 8 planned March loadings for Suezmax ships. And again, this is, even though they're staying fairly in the middle, they've always been a very big supporter of Russia in general, and they're likely to walk the line, and they have their own issues when you're looking at inflation, which continues to ramp up. So I would have expected, as we said previously, of them to jump in and buy some of these barrels. China's sitting on a lot in floating storage. They're not in any real hurry to buy at these prices, but India is obviously going to jump in. And again, also China also requires a significant amount of support from the U.S. Let's be clear. They need the U.S. So there's a fine line they have to walk, where India, while they need the U.S., they also need Russia a bit more, just in terms of some of these different products. But they're going to try to walk that line, because they don't want to lose their status in the Quad, as we talked about in the special show. So these are some of the key pieces that we want to look at. But regardless, India is a buyer, but it won't be enough. You're going to see a lot of that left in the water, because remember, India bought 6 million barrels. Now, they bought a total of 6 million barrels, and they're pushing out close to 4 million barrels a day. So that's going to leave some of this in the market. And it's going to be a matter of how much of that gets absorbed. Now shifting to the LNG side, because again, Europe consumes a lot of Russian natural gas, and this is just showing the amount that the U.S. is currently producing and putting into the water. Now, Europe and Japan are having conversations on how much natural gas LNG is going to be purchased past March, because there's some of this deal in terms of some of that additional going into Europe. But there's still a lot coming from the U.S. and as refiners go into maintenance season in Europe, that'll free up some additional, a little bit less capacity, but or I should say less demand. And at the same time, as things heat up, and going into spring, you'll consume a little bit less, which should offset a bit. But again, you're still seeing a big increase. Now on a NATO side, NATO has activated the defense plans to prepare to respond to a range of contingencies. And to be clear, this is the first time this has been activated in NATO's history. And I think that's a very big, a very big piece of. They've escalated. They've done things. NATO's gone in different levels, but this is the first time that they've actually activated their ready response. And I think that is going to be a very big pivot. And I don't know if there's new intelligence, but Sweden and Finland have come out and said that they are now considering joining NATO after saying they wouldn't. As we know, Russians and the Finnish have a very complicated and bloody history with Finland being fairly successful in defeating and staving off Russian attacks. So again, there's a lot of things that can be said about that. And again, as things increase in Ukraine, you're seeing more and more countries unite behind a common thread, and we think that this is going to progress even further. But we're going to talk about that in a minute, because we also have to talk about Russian LNG exports. Not only does Russia sell by pipe into Europe, but they also sell LNG exports into Europe and into China. So when you look at the lines of credit, what is this going to look like in terms of LNG exports coming from Russia? So just to break it down, China's largest state-owned banks are restricting financing of purchases of Russian commodities. Now, again, that's not just oil, that's broadly speaking, and I think that there is a huge problem. Now, there's a headline coming out that China says Ukraine's sovereignty territory should be respected. Now, there's going to be some back and forth, because then they soften that blow by saying China's stance of respecting nations' sovereignty and territorial integrity, abiding by the UN purpose, but Russia's legitimate demands on security should be recognized and addressed properly, given that NATO's continuous expansion to the east and creating a reasonable security concern. So again, they're walking that line because they have to, because they have to appease both sides. And this is one way of saying, hey guys, we're not going to do sanctions, but there's a lot of concerns in terms of where things are, so we're going to limit the amount of letters of credit. So this is going to be another pressure point when you look at how Russia is going to interact with some of these, because I think they were relying more on China, and this could be a little bit of a curveball, if you will, of what Russia was expecting. Now, before we get into some of the updates on where some of the shifts have been in Ukraine, it's important to talk about SWIFT, because people are making a big deal about where SWIFT is and if Russia is kicked out of the SWIFT system. So let's define what SWIFT is. So it's a means of moving money. So it's a fast way of doing it. It only came to pass in the 70s. Before the 70s, there were phone calls and confirmation of bank balances. SWIFT just makes that faster. And you can move large amounts of money in a very quick way. Now, Italy and Germany were very much against kicking Russia out of SWIFT yesterday. The U.S. was also hesitant in kicking them out yesterday. But this in the last 3 hours, we've seen a huge shift where now Germany, Italy, and the U.S. are open to kicking them out of SWIFT. Now, this will make doing business for Russia harder, But again, it's just a means of transacting. There's other ways to do it. We did it before. We've done it again. It just makes it harder. Now, the other thing that the U.S. can do is say that any SWIFT transaction that touches a U.S. bank cannot be tied to Russia. So that's another way to kind of limit it. And while they say it's kind of hard, every country has a code. For anyone that's ever dealt with SWIFT, I've done it. It's frustrating in its own right and it can be complicated, but it is something where you can just say, look, if this code is here, kick it out of the system. So again, some people are saying it's going to make it impossible for people to do business. It's going to be impossible for people. Again, you can still do business. It makes it way harder and more complicated, but you can still transact. It's just another means of impacting the underlying Russian economy. Now, when we look at some of the recent updates, and I like this chart, and this is, again, something that is put together, and it's free on Twitter. This is just looking at some of these shifts so far. I think it's important to kind of highlight some of the big pieces. So when you look at where Russian advances have come from the east, that's east going west, you can see that they've hit a lot of roadblocks on this advancement. There's been several areas in which the Ukrainians have been successful. We'll talk about that in a minute. Kyiv is still standing. There's still some movements when you look coming down and from Belarus. There are some concerns that they are going to mount a larger attack tomorrow when you look at what is being stationed within Belarus. And that's going to be one to watch. The Ukrainians did conduct a ballistic missile attack on one of the air bases, so it's the first open attack on Russian soil. Again, still, it was a direct hit. It took out several of a lot of the infrastructure there. And it's, again, a nice show of force. And then when you look at what is happening in just north of Crimea, the Ukrainians have actually had a lot of success there. And if you remember, prior to the all-out invasion, a significant amount of the Ukrainian military was positioned in that region. And it's very well situated in terms of defense. They fell back to a stronger area. A lot of the rivers that traverse in Kyiv and other the bridges and roadways have been destroyed in order to slow the mechanized movement. And there's been reports that Ukraine was so successful that they were able to push back some of these assets into Russian territory, i.e. Crimea. There were rumors of another amphibious attack into Odessa in that region. So far, there has been ongoing fighting, but the Ukrainians appear to be holding strong in that area prior to the oncoming nightfall. So the UK has said that Russian forces have opened a new route of advance towards Kyiv, having failed to capture Cherniv. And I know that I practiced that word beforehand, and I apologize because I am terrible at enunciations in all languages, not just Russian or Ukrainian. So one of the important pieces where by Russia failing to go through there, they've had to carve out another route. And by doing that, just if you think about military strategy, from a Ukrainian perspective, that allows them to launch counterattacks and hit the supply lines a little bit easier because you have a point of launch. And that's the biggest issue when you're looking at these, which is why you end up wanting to control very strategic areas, because then you take away the ability of the opposition to a counterattack and attack supply lines. And this is one of those important pieces whereby the Ukrainians able to holding this part, they can go attack and then fall back to a strong position. And again, this will make that move much harder when you're looking at how they've wanted to collapse on Kyiv from multiple levels. Now, on another side, Russian troops have stopped near the northeast city of Konotop after suffering heavy losses there. Again, that is another piece of a very important pie when you're looking at that movement. Now, Russia has also been suspended from the Council of Europe, which I don't think is surprising. And then again, going back to NATO, NATO has activated defense plans and are deploying elements of the NATO response force on land, at sea, and in the air, including thousands more troops and over 100 jets put on high alert in 30 locations. So when you look at where this has shifted, another key piece is cyber attacks can trigger Article 5 per the NATO Secretary General. If you remember, Article 5 is an open attack, where this is now used as something that can come in and get a bit more aggressive. NATO is moving forward in providing Ukraine with additional lethal weapons, including air defense systems. NATO is also deploying their response forces units. And then again, this is something that, and then to be clear, there are 5 countries that are openly decided to supply all weapons Ukraine asked for to defend the nation. Though it might be too late, the supply started yesterday. So this is just an aside. When you look at where things are, there's a certain amount of kinship between Ukraine and other ex-satellite nations. So these satellite nations have vowed from Poland on down to never fall back under the Iron Curtain. So there is a very big reason why I guarantee you those 5 nations would include Hungary, Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, and I think I said Poland, but in terms of Hungary and Romania, so there's probably 5 or 6 that would fall within that category within this region, because they're looking at this and saying this is much bigger than us, and we need to make sure that what is happening in Ukraine doesn't bleed over. Now, just thinking about some of the strengthening points. It's always in your best interest to use the fog of war, especially if you're coming in from the outside. A lot of these mechanical columns are very open to counterattack from the sky, just because Russia assumed air dominance, and so far they've been able to maintain it to a certain degree. There was the Ghost of Kiev. I pray to God that he is real, because that is one of the coolest things in a very terrible world that we've heard of. He was the first, if it's true, he's the first ace of this century. He has taken down 5 Russian fighters single-handedly. And that's something, again, just kind of rallying the troops. And by doing that, keeping that morale. If the U.S. and NATO gets involved, it is most likely to become a no-fly zone, which means that we would take away completely Russian air superiority. It would be a strong move, because it would also signal what we're capable of, as well as signal to the rest of the world that we still exist and we're still strong. The fact that Finland and Sweden obviously came out, that obviously got a rebuke from Putin, saying that if they join NATO, they will face severe consequences, both economic and militarily. So again, just ratcheting that up. So more things to come. Now, when you look at Ukraine grain shipments, I think this is a huge problem, especially when you consider about the amount of grain that comes from not only Russia, but also the Ukraine into the global market. We're facing massive shortfalls, which again from the U.S.'s perspective, we feed ourselves and we sell excess, but this is going to put additional strain on some key countries, with Egypt, Nigeria among top buyers, Turkey, Iran. You're getting an idea of a lot of these emerging markets are already struggling on the back of COVID, on the back of inflation, and by taking away a significant amount of these, again, what is more important than food, you're going to create a huge problem going forward, which again is something that we're going to that has to be considered when you're looking at what is going to be lost and what are some of the knock-on impacts that we're going to continue to see. Now, when you look at some of the pieces that we've talked about earlier, Russia, the central bank has been moving to euros and yuan, trying to get away from, that dollar dominance. You can see it started after 2018 and has only really accelerated when you look at the dollar and their holdings. And by doing so, they've been looking to increase their international reserves by using gold, by using everything else. And it shouldn't be surprising that move started after 2014 when everything happened with the Crimea, the DNR, and the LNR. So again, these are some of the key pieces that we continue to see. Now, just a touch on China. The stimulus that this time looks set to eclipse the cycle in 2020. But as you can see, one of the things that we've been talking about when you look at some of the growth and some of the problems in China and other places, here you can see that they're not picking back up. That you see a lot of continuous cuts and easing, but not tightening. And again, that's going to limit some of the what are the impacts and the tools that can be used. And here's, I think, a good quote: "The duration and tools are likely to be similar to 15 and 16, when, like now, the PBOC was facing a property market slump and weak domestic demand, though the pace and intensity may be shy of the easing then." And again, the fact that it's going to be shy is a problem, because this is showing you the law of diminishing returns. It needs to be bigger, which again is going to create other problems going forward. Now, when you look at the real estate investment, current conditions, are very similar to 15 and 16, and this is going to become a much bigger issue when you start looking at floor space, investments, and this is some of the overarching problems that we continue to see in China that we'll talk more about next week. So that's what we have for you today. Hopefully this was helpful. I know that we talked a bit about this in the special segment, but we wanted to follow up on what has happened so far. And if you have any questions, again, you can find me on Twitter. You can find me in the comment sections. And we hope you have a great weekend. And for those in terrible areas, stay safe. And we'll see you next week. Thanks again for watching. I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network.